Graphing the sine and cosine graphs requires a lot of information. You can see that the way that I want to graph it is to memorize the sine and cosine graph. This requires you to know the sine graph starts in the middle and goes up, and the cosine graph starts at the top and goes down. The general equations for the sine cosine graph have A, B's, C's, and D's in them. Each of those are important and determine the details of the graphs. The amplitude is the absolute value of A. The period is 2 pi over B. Don't worry about the absolute value in the period and phase shift. The units are the period divided by 4 or multiplied by 1/4. The phase shift is negative C over B, and the vertical shift is equal to D. I'll get into the specifics of those in the following. The amplitude is the distance from the midline to the top or the bottom. And so you're going to see that from this example, if you multiply by 2, the green line is twice as high as the red line. If you multiply by 1/2, it's a half the height. So that affects the height. The period, if you multiply 2x, x by 2, you're going to see that in this case, the red line moves twice as fast as the blue line. So the period is going to go from 2 pi all the way to just pi. And the way that you get the period is 2 pi over b. The phase shift. Phase shift is how far it has moved to the right or to the left. The phase shift here is equal to a negative c over b. Notice that the sine graph is going to have a phase shift the length of moving the left point to the right point. Frequency, the only thing you need to know here is going to be that it's equal to 1 over the period. Don't need that for the graph. Here's an example that goes through quite a few of the different transformations. Starting with the sine graph, by multiplying it by 2, notice that the amplitude goes up to 2. The period is 4x, so it's going to move through it a lot faster, 4 times as fast. Therefore, this period now becomes pi over 2 instead of 2 pi. Phase shift negative c over b becomes pi over 8. Notice that now the sine graph is going to shift to the right pi over 8 units and start there and start in the middle and go up again. And when you add 2 to it, notice that the whole graph moves up 2 units. Let's do a couple examples and see how they relate, starting with a little bit easier ones and working to the harder ones. I want to write down all the specifics that I need to. So, for example, the amplitude is equal to the absolute value of 3, which is 3. The period is equal to a negative c over b, 2 pi over b, which is 2, and therefore that's equal to pi. The units are going to be equal to pi over 4. There is no phase shift, there is no vertical shift. So when I do this, I'm going to start by making clicks. And for each click mark, you're going to go up by pi over 4 units. So I want to actually leave it in unsimplified form. And the amplitude is going to go up 3 and down 3. Now, this is the framework of it. And once you have the framework, you're going to remember the general cosine graph, which starts high and goes down, which means I'm going to start at this point, and every click mark is going to be the high, medium, or low. And then after you get that done, it's a matter of drawing the cosine graph. That's one cycle of the cosine graph. Of course, it would continue forever in both directions. Going to the next example. Again, starting with all of the details and then going from there. So, for example, the amplitude is equal to 1 because there is a 1 out in front. The period is 2 pi divided by your b, which is 3. The units are going to be 2 pi divided by 3 divided by 4, which is the same thing as times 1/4. And you would see that that's equal to pi over 6 after you simplify. And then you have a phase shift. The phase shift is equal to a negative c, negative 2, which is your c, negative c over b, and your b, negative 2 pi over b, which is going to be 3, and that equals 2 pi over 3. Now, very important, I like to match these units, the denominators. And so I want to multiply top and bottom by 2 because when I add my units to the phase shift, it'll be a lot easier now. So I'm going to start at 4 pi over 3, 4 pi over 6, and then add pi over 6 each time. After I do that, I should have 5 points. And now you're going to look and see what kind of graph it is. It's a sine graph, so you're going to start in the middle and go up as a little reminder. And I want to look at my amplitude, which is going to be 1. So here's my framework again, and I want to now put in the points. Once you put in the points, starting middle and going up, you then can graph one cycle of this graph, which is going to look like this. I'd like to do one more example and take a look at this one, number 2, and go ahead and get, again, the particulars. The amplitude is equal to 1. The period is going to be 2 pi over b, which is just 2 pi. Units are going to be 2 pi over 4. And the phase shift is negative c, let's see, negative pi over 3 over b, which is 1, which is pi over 3. And again, I want these units to match, so okay, that makes it a little bit harder. That means it's going to be, well, if I simplified that, it's pi over 2. Now it's a little bit easier, so 6 is going to be my denominator. Therefore, this is 3 pi over 6, and this is 2 pi over 6. Now the units match. And you've got a vertical shift of 2 units. All right, let's go ahead and graph this one. Cosine starts up high and goes down. Starting with the phase shift. Always start with the phase shift first. 2 pi over 6. 2 pi over 6, which then I'm going to take a look at the units. Every 3 pi over 6, so that becomes 5 pi over 6. 8 pi over 6, add in 3. There are my 5 points. I then go and look at the amplitude again. So that's going to be negative 1 and 1. And I'm not going to worry about this vertical shift yet. So I'm looking at this cosine graph, which means I'm going to start up high and go down, which looks like this. And go ahead and graph that. And now you're going to see that that's going to be this graph. Now, a couple other things. Now that we want to add 2 to the vertical asymptotes, an easy way to do this is just to say, okay, well, instead of this as a 2, I'm going to add 1. I'm going to add 2 to it, so make that a 3. And instead of negative 1, I'm going to add 2 to it and make that a 1. So these are my new y's, y max, y min, and I can easily see that. That's a lot easier than making all new points up here and trying to graph that again. One other point is if this were a negative out front, if it were a negative 1, that would mean that it's going to reflect down from the x-axis, which would mean that the drawing would look like this. Now, along with that point, at this point, we're going to have a positive sign and a negative sign, a positive cosine and a negative cosine. And these graphs are going to look like this, more or less, starting in the middle, going up, starting in the middle, going down. Cosine starts up on top, negative cosine is going to start on the bottom. These you definitely have to commit to memory. That's a real short presentation on how to graph the sine and cosine transformations and all of the details on those graphs.